What if the road you live on once had a different name and no one remembers why it changed? In 1921, an entire street in Riverton, Ohio vanished from official maps. Not destroyed, not redeveloped, just renamed. And whatever happened there was buried with the old sign. On the surface, it was routine. Cities rename streets all the time. Postal adjustments, modernization, political changes. But Ashbury Lane didn't change gradually. It disappeared abruptly. Within a year, every city document replaced it with a new name, Brighton Avenue. No ceremony, no announcement in the paper, no surviving ordinance explaining why. And when historians later tried to trace the reason, they found something stranger than a missing sign. They found a missing story. In 1919, Ashbury Lane did not look like the kind of street that would one day disappear. It ran only 2 blocks long on the eastern edge of Riverton, Ohio, pressed between a rail yard and a row of low brick factories that produced stove parts and machine fittings. The street was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 wagons to pass without slowing. Its surface was hard-packed dirt, turning to mud in the rain and chalky dust in the summer. The houses were identical in shape, but not in personality. 2-story brick row homes stood shoulder to shoulder, their facades darkened by coal smoke drifting from factory stacks. Each had a short stoop, a narrow front window, and a back door that opened into small fenced yards where laundry lines stretched like flags of ordinary life. In the evenings, lamplight glowed softly behind curtains while the distant clang of metal from the rail yard echoed through the air. Ashbury Lane was working class in the purest sense. Men rose before dawn and walked together toward the factories. Women swept their stoops in the morning and traded conversation across low iron fences. Children ran freely from one end of the street to the other, their games paused only when freight wagons rumbled past. At the very end of the lane stood number 14, a 3-story boarding house that broke the rhythm of the row homes. It was taller, slightly set back, with a pitched roof and narrow attic windows. The paint, once white, had weathered into a pale gray that seemed to absorb the soot around it. A wooden sign near the door read, "Rooms available," though by most accounts it was rarely vacant. The boarding house served railway workers and factory hands who passed through Riverton on temporary contracts. Suitcases appeared and disappeared regularly. Faces changed with the seasons. Yet the house itself remained constant, its windows watching the street like steady eyes. From the outside, Ashbury Lane felt contained, almost tucked away from the rest of the city. Main Street, with its grocers and barber shops, was several blocks west. Streetcars did not run down Ashbury. Residents walked if they needed transport. This physical separation gave the lane a sense of quiet independence. What happened there tended to stay there. City directories described Ashbury Lane in plain terms: residential, industrial, adjacent. Insurance maps showed tidy outlines of each structure, marked with neat labels indicating brick construction and slate roofing. On paper, it was orderly. But lived experience rarely matches the precision of maps. The proximity to the rail yard meant nights were rarely silent. Steam whistles pierced the dark at irregular hours. Metal couplings clashed with sharp, jarring bangs. Coal ash drifted down like gray snow, settling on windowsills and into the cracks of front steps. And yet, to its residents, this was not disturbance. It was familiarity. The noise was proof of employment, the smoke evidence of wages earned. Ashbury Lane carried the rhythm of labor and routine. It was not glamorous, it was not notorious. It was simply there, anchored in its place, its name printed confidently on every official map of the era. That name mattered more than anyone realized. Because when a place is small, its identity is fragile. A short street does not command attention. It does not host parades or attract reporters. It exists in the margins of the city's story. And margins are easier to erase. Before 1920, Ashbury Lane was a fixed point on Riverton's grid, a modest corridor of brick and soot and shared lives. Children memorized its length by heart. Mail carriers knew each address without looking down. The name was spoken daily, written on envelopes, stamped on forms. It was ordinary in every visible way, which is precisely why what happened next would be so easy to overlook. If Ashbury Lane existed solidly in brick and mortar, it also existed in ink. Its name appeared in city directories, printed annually in tight, orderly columns. It was etched into property tax rolls, typed onto postal route sheets, and carefully drawn onto Sanborn fire insurance maps. On paper, Ashbury Lane was not just a street, it was an administrative fact, a fixed reference point in Riverton's growing grid. And then, quite suddenly, that fact began to blur. The first irregularity appears in late 1919. Property tax logs for number 14, the boarding house, show payments made consistently through September. The entry for October is marked differently, written in a tighter script as though added later. By December, the ledger space beside the address is left blank. Not marked delinquent, not marked paid, simply blank. In municipal bookkeeping, blank space is unusual. Clerks were trained to account for every dollar, every property. Even unpaid taxes were annotated carefully, sometimes in red ink to indicate arrears. But here, there is only absence. The following year, 1920, presents something stranger. The property ownership column for number 14 lists no private individual. Instead, it carries a short notation, MT, believed by historians to mean municipal transfer. No sale price is recorded, no foreclosure proceedings are attached, no probate file exists in county archives. The house appears to have passed briefly into city hands without a documented path. Minutes from city council meetings during this same period are incomplete. Between August and November 1919, several pages are missing from the bound ledger stored at Riverton's municipal archive. The spine remains intact. Page numbers jump cleanly from 112 to 119. Whether those pages were removed intentionally or lost to time cannot be proven, but their absence overlaps precisely with the final recorded activity at number 14. Street renamings, even minor ones, typically required formal approval. Ordinances were drafted, public notices were posted in newspapers, residents were informed of address adjustments to prevent confusion with mail and emergency services. Yet no ordinance announcing the renaming of Ashbury Lane has been located. Sanborn maps provide another layer of evidence. The 1920 edition shows Ashbury Lane clearly labeled, each structure neatly outlined. In the 1923 revision, the same street layout appears, but the label reads Brighton Avenue. No footnote explains the change, no boundary adjustment suggests a merger with an adjacent road. The street's physical dimensions remain identical, only the name is different. City directories reflect the shift just as abruptly. The 1921 edition omits Ashbury Lane entirely. Brighton Avenue appears in its place, listing the same property numbers but skipping from 12 directly to 16. There is no listing for number 14. The space where the boarding house once stood is not reassigned. It is erased. Archivists who examined the records decades later noted that paper from the era generally survives well in Riverton's collection. Water damage affected some volumes, but not selectively. The missing council pages show no staining, no deterioration, only clean separation. It is impossible to say whether this pattern represents clerical oversight, administrative consolidation, or something more deliberate. But bureaucracies are built on documentation. They preserve everything from dog licenses to sewer permits. For a street to vanish from the record without trace requires more than forgetfulness. It requires action. Ashbury Lane did not decay from the archives slowly. It was replaced swiftly.
as if someone had decided that continuity itself was a liability. By 1922, every official reference to Ashbury Lane had been overwritten, maps adjusted, ledgers corrected, postal routes redrawn. In the language of government, it was as though the street had always been Brighton Avenue. The transformation was not loud. There were no headlines, no public debates, just a quiet substitution in ink. And ink, once dried, is difficult to challenge.
Before the street changed its name, before the records thinned and the maps were redrawn, there was a family living at number 14. Clara Hensley arrived on Ashbury Lane in 1908, according to city directory listings. She was 33 years old, recently widowed, and listed her occupation simply as proprietor. The boarding house became both her livelihood and her shield against poverty. In an industrial town like Riverton, rooms were always needed. Railway mechanics, factory foremen, traveling salesmen, they came and went with steady regularity. The 1910 federal census lists Clara living in the house with 4 children: Thomas, age 12, Ruth, 10, Samuel, 7, and Lillian, 5. All were recorded as attending school. The document describes Clara as literate, renting rooms to 8 boarders at the time of enumeration. On paper, it was a stable household. Neighbors later described the Hensleys as reserved but dependable. Clara attended church sporadically. The children walked together to the nearby public school each morning. They were neither isolated nor especially social, just another family navigating working-class life. But boarding houses blur the line between private and public space. Strangers moved in and out under Clara's roof. Meals were shared at long tables. Hallways echoed with unfamiliar footsteps. Privacy was thin. By 1918, the number of long-term boarders appears to have decreased. City directories list fewer occupants under number 14. Some historians suggest that post-war economic shifts affected railway employment, reducing the demand for lodging. Then comes the final documented year, 1919. The spring directory still lists Clara Hensley as proprietor. The fall edition does not. There is no obituary for Clara in Riverton newspapers, no death certificate in county archives, no remarriage record under her name. The 1920 federal census, taken in January of that year, contains no trace of the Hensley family in Riverton, nor have researchers located a clear record of their relocation to another state. The name appears elsewhere in the country, but without verifiable links. Families moved frequently in the early 20th century. Economic hardship forced relocation, widows remarried, children were sent to live with relatives. Ordinary explanations exist. Yet what unsettles researchers is not that the Hensleys left, it is how completely they vanished from local documentation. Former residents interviewed decades later offered fragmented recollections. One elderly man, who claimed to have lived 2 houses down as a child, remembered a commotion one autumn evening. He spoke of raised voices and a sharp smell, though whether he meant smoke or something else he could not clarify. Another account described police presence on the street after dark, horses tied at the corner, lantern light moving in and out of the boarding house. Memory is unreliable, especially when filtered through decades. Details warp, timelines blur. Still, multiple accounts converge on a single idea. Something occurred at number 14 before the family disappeared. And yet, no missing persons report survives bearing their names. If the Hensleys chose to leave quietly, they left behind no forwarding address. If tragedy struck, it left behind no formal acknowledgement. Their absence feels less like migration and more like subtraction. The children who once raced down Ashbury Lane chasing marbles and skipping rope are never mentioned again in school rosters after 1919. Their teachers' annual reports list enrollment changes, but no explanation accompanies the reduction in names. Clara Hensley's signature, once appearing on property tax documents, ceases entirely. There's a difference between departure and erasure. Departure leaves a trail.
Train tickets, new addresses, marriages, graves. Erasure leaves stillness. By the time Ashbury Lane itself was renamed, the Hensley family had already faded from view. Their boarding house stood briefly empty, its windows dark. And whatever occurred within its walls traveled nowhere beyond that street, except, perhaps, into silence.
Silence rarely arrives all at once. It settles gradually, like dust. After the autumn of 1919, Ashbury Lane did not erupt into scandal. There were no headlines splashed across Riverton's newspapers, no public inquest, no courtroom proceedings that drew crowds to the steps of City Hall. Instead, there was a narrowing of conversation. Residents later recalled that number 14 stood dark for several weeks, curtains drawn, no boarders arriving with suitcases, no smoke rising from the chimney as winter crept in. In a street accustomed to constant motion, factory shifts changing, children weaving between stoops, the stillness of the boarding house felt unnatural. But in working-class neighborhoods, people learned quickly not to pry. Privacy was both courtesy and survival. If authorities came and went in the night, if a wagon stopped longer than usual outside a door, it was safer not to ask questions. Within months, the house was described as vacant in city listings. By early 1920, work crews were seen removing interior fixtures. One account mentions shutters taken down first, then sections of roofing. No formal demolition notice appears in the surviving municipal record, yet by the following year, number 14 no longer stood at the end of the lane. Where it once cast a shadow, there was open ground. Silence deepened in subtler ways. Children who once referred casually to the Hensley house began to avoid the subject. Adults redirected conversation when the name surfaced. The absence of a visible structure made it easier to treat the location as unremarkable. And then came the shift in language. The first time Brighton Avenue appeared in place of Ashbury Lane, it did not spark outrage. Mail continued to arrive, the liveries adjusted without visible disruption. The physical street was unchanged, brick, stoops, narrow roadway. But the old name faded quickly from daily speech. A street's name is repeated constantly, written on envelopes, spoken to taxi drivers, memorized by school children. When that repetition stops, memory weakens. The old syllables lose weight. By 1922, younger residents referred confidently to Brighton Avenue as though it had always existed. The transformation felt seamless. Local historian Margaret Ellis, writing decades later, described interviewing elderly former residents in the 1960s. Some hesitated when she asked about Ashbury Lane, as though the question itself felt intrusive. Others acknowledged the name, but could not recall when it disappeared. One interviewee offered a telling remark. "We were told it was better not to stir it up." Told by whom is unclear. There were no public proclamations urging discretion, no printed warnings, but communities often absorb cues without instruction. When officials avoid a topic, when newspapers omit details, when neighbors lower their voices, the message is understood. Silence becomes communal. It is important to note that early 20th century cities were accustomed to managing reputations. Industrial towns depended on outside investment and labor recruitment. Publicized violence or scandal could harm economic stability. In that context, restraint, whether motivated by caution or concealment, was not unusual. But Ashbury Lane's quiet felt disproportionate.
No fire report acknowledged the destruction of a 3-story building. No relocation notice documented the boarding house residents. No explanation accompanied the renaming. Instead, there was administrative efficiency. Papers adjusted, labels updated, conversations shortened. Over time, the silence achieved something more powerful than denial. It created doubt. Without documentation, memories become contested. Without acknowledgement, events shrink into rumor. The longer nothing is said, the easier it becomes to question whether anything happened at all. And so, Ashbury Lane entered a different kind of existence, not as a place remembered for tragedy, but as a place forgotten. Not because time erased it, but because nothing was allowed to remain.
For nearly 6 decades, the ground where number 14 once stood remained undisturbed. After the boarding house was removed, the lot at the end of what was now called Brighton Avenue sat empty for years. Photographs from the 1930s show a patch of uneven earth where children occasionally cut across as a shortcut. By the 1950s, a chain-link fence enclosed the space. Weeds grew waist-high in summer. In winter, snow drifted across it without obstruction. It became what urban planners sometimes call a residual lot, a piece of land left behind by change. In 1978, a local developer purchased the parcel as part of a broader housing initiative. Riverton was expanding, and demand from modest apartment complexes had risen. Surveyors marked the ground with wooden stakes. Backhoes arrived in early spring. The excavation began without ceremony. At first, workers encountered what they expected: brick fragments, rusted nails, shards of window glass. Remnants of any demolished building often remain beneath the soil, especially those removed before modern disposal regulations. But several feet below the surface, the soil changed color. Instead of the usual compacted brown clay, there was a thick layer of darkened earth, almost charcoal in tone. When disturbed, it released a faint odor, stale but unmistakably burned. Within that layer were larger structural remnants, partially blackened beams, warped by intense heat. Not merely discarded wood, but wood that had endured fire. Construction crews paused and notified city inspectors. Among the debris were smaller items: a cluster of glass marbles fused together as if briefly melted, the handle of a metal spoon bent at an unnatural angle, a locket tarnished and sealed shut, discovered tangled in the soil. The locket reportedly contained 2 miniature portrait photographs, their edges curled and discolored by heat exposure. The images were too damaged for clear identification, but the faint outline of children's faces could be seen. Fire department archives were consulted. No recorded blaze of that scale appears for Ashbury Lane or Brighton Avenue in 1919 or the years immediately following. Smaller kitchen fires were common in that era, but a structural burn intense enough to char beams several feet below ground would likely have generated a report, yet none exists. City officials classified the findings as residual debris from an undocumented structure fire, possibly occurring during or after demolition. The explanation was practical. Demolition practices in the early 20th century were not always formally recorded, and fires sometimes accompanied controlled teardown efforts. Construction resumed. The objects were cataloged briefly before being boxed and transferred to municipal storage. Their current whereabouts are unclear. No forensic testing was conducted beyond basic inspection. At the time, there was no legal case to pursue, no active investigation to reopen. But for historians examining the event decades later, the discovery reframed the narrative. If the boarding house had burned either before or during demolition, why was there no fire report? Why were nearby structures undamaged according to insurance maps?
Why was the property transferred so abruptly into municipal control? Fire leaves evidence that paper cannot always erase. It embeds itself into foundations. It alters soil composition. It reshapes wood at a chemical level. Unlike names in directories, physical traces resist revision. The layer of ash beneath number 14 suggested something more intense than routine removal. It implied heat, duration, and perhaps urgency. Still, evidence alone does not reveal motive. The discovery did not prove violence. It did not confirm a crime. It only complicated the official version of events. And sometimes complication is enough to reopen questions long assumed settled. For nearly 60 decades, the ground kept its memory. When it was finally disturbed, it offered fragments, not answers. Fragments are unsettling because they demand interpretation. They force us to ask not only what happened, but why no one recorded it.
By the time the ash layer was uncovered in 1978, nearly everyone directly connected to Ashbury Lane was gone. The factory workers had retired or passed away. The children who once skipped rope along the dirt road were elderly, their memories softened by time, which made accountability almost impossible. There was no open case to revisit, no charges to file, no living officials to question directly about the missing council pages or the unexplained municipal transfer of number 14. And yet, when historians began aligning the fragments, the vanished family, the missing documentation, the renamed street, the buried fire damage, a pattern emerged that felt less accidental than administrative. Cover-ups in small industrial cities of the early 20th century rarely resembled dramatic conspiracies. They were quieter than that. They operated through omission rather than fabrication. If a violent incident occurred inside a boarding house, whether accidental or intentional, the immediate priority in 1919 would have been containment. Riverton was economically fragile after World War I. Labor strikes were rising nationwide. Investment depended on stability. Public scandal could ripple outward quickly. City leaders may have faced a choice: publicize the event and risk panic, or manage it discreetly and preserve order. There are precedents. Across the country, municipalities have historically minimized reports of workplace fatalities, epidemics, and violent disputes to prevent unrest. Newspapers often relied on city officials for information, and what was not released rarely appeared in print. If number 14 experienced a catastrophic event, fire, violence, or something more complex, it could have been classified as an internal matter, a private tragedy rather than a public emergency. The temporary municipal ownership of the property becomes particularly significant in that light. When a city assumes control of a property without clear foreclosure or inheritance documentation, it suggests intervention. Whether that intervention was legal consolidation after abandonment or something more deliberate remains unknown. What followed, the swift demolition and subsequent renaming, feels coordinated in retrospect. Renaming a street achieves something subtle but powerful. It disrupts continuity. Researchers searching for Ashbury Lane after 1921 would find nothing. Census cross-referencing becomes complicated. Newspaper archives indexed by street name yield no results. Oral histories grow uncertain as younger generations recognize only Brighton Avenue. A name change severs the thread connecting past to present. Importantly, there is no document that explicitly states rename the street to conceal an incident. Cover-ups are rarely written so plainly. Instead, they unfold through procedural efficiency. A council vote recorded on a missing page, a demolition noted without explanation, a map revised without commentary. Each step appears mundane in isolation. Together, they reshape reality.
By the 1930s, Ashbury Lane no longer existed in any official capacity. Brighton Avenue had absorbed its geography and its narrative. The boarding house was reduced to memory, then to rumor. And rumor, lacking documentation, eventually collapses under its own uncertainty. Was there truly a deliberate effort to erase what happened there? Absolute proof remains elusive. But erasure does not always require a secret meeting or sworn oath. It can emerge from a shared understanding that some events are better forgotten. When institutions prioritize stability over transparency, policy becomes policy. And policy, once enacted, is difficult to reverse. The buried ash did not accuse anyone. The missing records did not confess. But the convergence of disappearance, of family, of property ownership, of official minutes, of a street name itself, forms a pattern too deliberate to dismiss lightly. A cover-up does not have to be elaborate. Sometimes it is simply a decision made quietly and never spoken of again.
Today, Brighton Avenue looks like it has always belonged to the city. Cars line the curb in neat rows. Children ride bicycles past trimmed hedges. Delivery trucks pause briefly before moving on. The asphalt is smooth now, long paved over what was once a narrow dirt road. Nothing about it hints at interruption. Nothing suggests that its name replaced another. But geography can be honest even when memory is not. Stand at the far end of Brighton Avenue, where number 14 once stood, and there is a subtle irregularity in the alignment of the houses. The spacing feels slightly wider. The rhythm of the architecture shifts for just a moment before continuing. It is the faintest disruption, easily dismissed as coincidence. Yet that empty space once held a boarding house filled with voices. A widow balancing accounts at a kitchen table. Children climbing narrow stairs to the attic rooms. Boarders arriving with suitcases and leaving with wages earned. Now, there is only ground. What makes Ashbury Lane unsettling is not that something tragic may have occurred there. Tragedy, unfortunately, is common in history. Fires happen, conflicts escalate, families move away or fall apart. What makes this story different is the systematic thinning of trace. The name disappeared, the records fractured, the property transferred without clarity. The fire left no report, the family left no forward address. Individually, each absence could be explained. Together, they form a silence too structured to ignore. History often survives through repetition. Streets are remembered because they are spoken daily. Families endure in records because documents reaffirm their existence. When repetition stops, memory weakens. By renaming Ashbury Lane, the city didn't just change a label, it interrupted continuity. Future generations would not search for Ashbury if they never knew it existed. Researchers would not cross-reference records tied to a street that no longer appeared on maps. It is a quiet method of obscurity. And perhaps that is the most unsettling possibility. That erasure does not require destruction. It only requires substitution. Brighton Avenue replaced Ashbury Lane so seamlessly that the past slipped beneath the surface without resistance. The physical street remained, but its identity shifted. Over time, even those who remembered the old name hesitated to speak it. Language adapted, paperwork adjusted, memory followed. What happened at number 14 may never be proven conclusively. The ash layer suggests fire. The missing minutes suggest administrative action. The vanished family suggests sudden departure. But proof is not the only measure of truth. Patterns matter. When physical evidence contradicts official silence, when documentation narrows instead of expands, when a name vanishes at the same moment a story does, it invites reflection. Cities, like people, curate their histories.
They highlight achievements and streamline discomfort. They memorialize victories and compress controversy. Sometimes they do this intentionally. Sometimes it happens through quiet consensus. Either way, what remains is a polished surface over uneven ground. Brighton Avenue continues forward in time, its residents unaware that their address once carried a different identity. They walk across soil that holds remnants of something unrecorded. They receive mail delivered to a name that replaced another. The street is alive. The name beneath it is not. And somewhere in the transition between the two, a chapter of Riverton's story closed without being written. Some histories aren't lost, they're hidden. If you've ever discovered an old map with a street that no longer exists, or noticed a place in your city where the story feels incomplete, take a closer look. Sometimes the smallest changes, a missing name, a blank space in a ledger, an unexplained gap, can reveal more than what's written clearly. Because history doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it's simply renamed. And the only way to uncover it is to start asking why.